My company specifically is an inclusive design consultancy called Inclus. We're trying to help make consumer products in particular, so physical products, more accessible and more inclusively designed for social minority groups. There's millions of people calling out for design changes and calling out for things that need to be fixed and things that need to be improved. And organizations at the moment are just not tapping into those communities enough and aren't listening well enough. And so that's something I'm hoping I can change.
Robert, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm feeling good. Thank you. How are you, Brooke?
Do you know what? We're getting there. New laptop, new week, nearly a new month. So actually, it's all the newness and I'm really ready for it. February's been a bit like December for me. So I'm quite excited for some routine and some structure, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I feel like the start of every kind of year is a bit like that. You start getting back into new habits, new routines. I'm definitely in a similar situation. It's all going at a million miles per hour. So
Yeah. Or it's always the way, but actually I quite like it like that. I'd be a bit lost if everything was just pretty mundane and pretty the same. So I'm looking forward to maybe a little bit of structure and a little bit of chaos, but we'll see. So the first question that I ask everybody on this podcast is, Robert, how do you refer to your disability?
so it was funny you say this because I was listening to previous episodes and I heard this question come up. So I was thinking about it quite a bit. Um, but for me, I say that I have two non-visible disabilities. Um,
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the fact that I'm neurodivergent, so I have dyspraxia, and dyspraxia, of course, for many different individuals can mean many different things.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's predominantly kind of the symptoms of thought processing being a little bit slower sometimes. It's also
Mm-hmm.
quite a lot of what I experience in day-to-day life is I have poor motor control and wrist dexterity. So I struggle
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of things when it comes to like chopping and peeling in the kitchen, or even something as simple as my mom always used to point it out if I was holding a cup of tea, I would shake a bit. So it's lots of
Mm-hmm.
little things like that. Uh, and then on the other side of the coin, I also say the fact that I have a non-visible disability and the fact that I'm a cancer survivor. So
Mm-hmm.
that in terms of uh, as a disability and my experiences of lack of accessibility, I find is quite interesting because it's changed over time. Um,
Yeah.
so I was diagnosed with testicular cancer in 2019, and
Mm-hmm.
consequently, that period, that was where I felt a massive amount of lack of accessibility, both because of mentally of how I was feeling, but also physically because of surgery and chemotherapy. And then
Mm-hmm.
over time, that kind of lack of accessibility or the way that has affected my life has changed. It's nowhere near as bad as what it once was, but I still define it to
Mm-hmm.
be as a form of impairment that I still experience every single day. It's just luckily
Mm-hmm.
the experience isn't as bad as it once was. But yeah, that's how I would
Yeah.
define my disabilities in that sense.
Yeah. And dyspraxia. So I always get dyspraxia and dyslexia mixed up because I feel like they're similar, but they're not similar at all. And in my head, the best way that I once had someone explain dyspraxia to me was if you and I were throwing and catching a ball, and I threw the ball to you, and the ball was going to your left hand side, you would reach to your right hand side because that's where your brain is putting two and two together. And your experience of dyspraxia, would you say that's accurate or inaccurate?
So this is why I find kind of neurodivergency really interesting because
Mm-hmm.
it's so diverse.
Yeah.
So I speak to a lot of people that have dyspraxia and they go, "Oh, are you really clumsy?" And I find that if I am, I don't notice it.
Mm-hmm.
So for some people, they notice it a little bit more. For me, I don't notice it as much. But in terms of that kind of ball throwing exercise, quite literally, one of the things that I've always been told from birth, and I never really realized it until I thought about it more, is the fact that I quite literally see the world differently. Not in a sense of long sightedness or short sightedness or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that. But the easiest way to explain it is what doctors used to say to my parents is that when you see a tree, what Rob sees is not the tree, but the branches, the leaves, the bark, like all the individual elements. I seem to hyper focus a lot more on very specific things, which is both a superpower and also really annoying sometimes. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I can imagine that as like, and this, oh my God, this is such a seamless transition. I'm going to pat myself on the back for this. With that, I can imagine during childhood was quite an interesting experience because, like you said, you can hyperfixate on things that you can see, but not everybody else around you sees. So, like that tree and the bark analogy, I can imagine myself doing the exact same thing. To be quite honest, because I think we all are very much aware. I am very much undiagnosed ADHD, so I hyperfixate on quite random stuff. But I can so imagine as a child, and using this tree analogy because that's one that I really really like, you hyperfixating on the bark and nobody else being able to, and then just seeing a tree and wood, and you're trying to explain what you can see and everyone's like, Rob, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
How was that experience during childhood? What was that like for you?
So, so through childhood, I mean, childhood in general, I've been through absolutely all sorts. But it's a case of that. It's definitely a case of that. The way I found it was that a lot of the time it kind of came into, in terms of very physically, in terms of with creative subjects, for example, I found that creative
Mm,
subjects were a lot easier because I could do problem solving a lot easier. I could be more creative. I found stuff like design and technology and drama fun and easy to do. But in a weird way, that kind of hyper focus I have found then over the years, even as I was going through school, shows up in other ways in terms of probably more cognitively in terms of how I hyper focus sometimes on things so in particular that then you kind of get blinkered. So I went through a phase at school of where I I was really passionate about rugby and I was really passionate about sports and I absolutely loved it. And I found myself when I got to around about 11 realizing, oh my gosh, I'm like really hyper focused on that and I'm not concentrating on anything else. And I wanted to take a step back and then kind of go, so do I want to be playing rugby when I'm like 18 and do I actually enjoy this for the longer term? And it then made me realize I don't. And so that's what then helped me to make
mm-hmm.
a lot of decisions throughout my childhood and throughout education and all those huge decisions of what you can do for your GCSEs, what you can do for A levels, where do you want to go to uni, and the classic question of what do you want to do in the future? And it was something that I then had to kind of get myself to think about a lot, and I did really enjoy thinking about it. But I think that's where the hyper focus went. It went from focusing on something very particular to if I came up with a vision that I was going to become a paleontologist at like age 11, then that's what I was going to do and that's what I was going to pursue.
Yeah.
And then it would just hop and hop and hop and hop from different things I've done. So,
I have to say that I honestly think it's the worst thing in the world to try and make kids decide what they want to do at like 15, 16, 17. Because I look at who I
mm,
was when I was 15, 16, and 17, and I'm like, I don't, me and that person, don't get me wrong, we're the same person, but we're very, very different. Like,
mm,
and what I
mm,
wanted to do back then is not what I want to do now. Like, they're very, very different. And so the idea that we would have that solidified in our mind at such a young age honestly baffles me. And it also, people who know what they want to do from like a super young age baffle me. Absolutely baffle me because I'm like, what about if this changes, or what about if that changes? Like, what if you don't love this anymore? Like, salute you because I think it's an incredible thing to be able to do, but it's just not for me. And I think we should
mm.
maybe give kids a bit more leniency when it comes to deciding what they they want to do in life.
Oh, definitely. It's definitely something as a kid I realized, and I think I realize it even more now as a young adult, is the fact of that sometimes that kind of questioning can be too defined, that you need to
Mm-hmm.
know exactly what you wanted to go after and you need to know the job, you need to know the qualifications required and blah, blah, blah. I think what I got around about age 16, 17, which kind of leads into what I do today,
Yeah.
was not understanding per se the job I was going to do or understanding the career per se, but I just understood what I was passionate about and what was my kind of mission of sorts. And every single
Mm-hmm.
time I go and reflect, I always go back to this mission of wanting to make this more inclusive and accessible world. And I think that from around about age 16, 17 made me realize, okay, this is what I really want to go after. And again, a hyper focus just makes you
Yeah.
go, right, we're going a million miles per hour. We're going to do this, and I'm going to do anything that's in this space that can help me to do it. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
If you don't mind, I would like to rewind because you said
Mm.
something about having your cancer diagnosis and then realizing how inaccessible the world is. And I was wondering if you could delve into that a little bit more because I'm intrigued to understand the link between the cancer diagnosis and that experience, but also the inaccessibility that you experienced during that time and how it's evolved as well.
Yeah. There's elements to it that's very nuanced in the fact because I had testicular cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Testicular cancer, unlike some cancers, is quite a physical change because
Yeah.
the process I had to go through is surgery to remove my left testy, which had the
Mm-hmm.
cancer within it, and then you go through chemotherapy afterwards. And so that makes a lot of changes to your body. And I think
Yeah.
when I kind of pigeonhole dyspraxia and my experience with cancer, it's kind of that I always just looked at dyspraxia as though that it was some form of learning difficulty and that I struggled a little bit more at school, and so I didn't really need to do anything because I always found a
Mm-hmm.
coping mechanism, or I always was just like, it doesn't matter, and just move on. But
Mm-hmm.
with going through the whole process of having cancer, it reduced me so much as an individual that I found myself experiencing things entirely differently in the world. So mentally was a huge shift. I'd never been kind
Mm-hmm.
of in such a huge depression spiral and such a spiral into feeling so anxious all the time that
Mm-hmm.
it made me then realize how that then ties into experiences we have every single day. If it's something that can be a kind of sensory overload, like going into a shopping center, or if it can be something as simple as just interacting with a product and what the smells that come
Mm-hmm.
from that, the sensory experience that comes from that, and how that would then link to how I felt mentally. And then even on the physical side of things, I found that so I'm somebody who is like incredibly active. I love doing runs and running ultra marathons for like charity and doing
Mm-hmm.
probably too many physical activities. Um, but consequently, after the surgery that I had, I quite literally was bedridden for about 2 weeks. And this is the first time that it ever
Yeah.
happened in my life. And all of a sudden I realized, wow, life is really different. And it gave me this sort of, probably is how it would be coined by like Microsoft's inclusive design toolkit, is like a temporary impairment of sorts. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it then gave me this entirely new perspective of realizing, okay, some things are an entirely different experience to what I expected, and some things are so much harder than I
Mm-hmm.
realized just on the basis of that I couldn't move from this bed to eventually going back to where I was of now being able to do runs again and being physically fit in that
Mm-hmm.
sense. So it was a huge life-changing experience that I think, if anything, it gave me more fire in my belly to go after what I'm doing today and to pursue that because it made me not realize. So this is something I hate is when somebody says, it made me realize what it's like to be somebody in a wheelchair or something like that. No, 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 no.
Mm-hmm.
It made me empathize better of what that experience could be like. I still
Mm-hmm.
will always accept I will never know what that experience will be like, but it 100% made me see the world in an entirely different way, which I'd never expected before.
I love what you said just then about empathizing and that you will never understand that experience because I think there's so much to be said in the language that was used. Because it's right. Like for me, I will never experience that. I don't know what that experience is like. I mean, maybe I will, years down the line, or if I have an accident or something happens. but you can empathize. And I think that there is such a big difference in being able to say that and being able to appreciate that. And I think a lot of people really respect that rather than being like, oh, like it made me realize this, and like now I totally understand the plight of a disabled person. And you're like, actually, you don't. Like, it was temporary, you don't, but you can kind of understand the feeling. You don't know what the experience is like when it's like this 24/7, 365.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I think people need to realize that empathy actually can go a long way. It might seem very like wishy-washy, but actually empathy can go a long way, and empathy is a lot more appreciated than someone falsely sympathizing with you because they had this one experience this one time, and actually it's not the same. It's really not.
Yeah, it's something I get it all the time with any organization I interact with. Some of the best individuals who are not necessarily somebody with a disability, but it's the fact that they have somebody who's close in their family or their friends, or they've been through an experience, but they have the self-awareness to understand that it is something that can help to build empathy and builds like the tiniest percentage of a picture of what it is like to live with uh, that said disability throughout, as you say, 365 days of the year, 24 hours a day. So, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for me, at least in terms of kind of physical impairments and physical lack of accessibility, that was a big shifter for me and
Yeah.
mentally framing how the world looks in that sense. And as I say, though, it just gave me more ammo to really go after it and be like, why is the world like this? And why is it that I've had to go through experiences like this? And even off the back of it, societally, why is it normal for somebody to ask these questions or to presume this and that?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a life changing experience. I can't call it anything else other than that.
Yeah. This also ties, oh my gosh, this is seamless transitions today. Like, people are listening to this, I don't think they realize how nice it is when it all works out like this. But with that in mind, how has your disabilities, how has it impacted your career and the choices that you've made to what you work in now? And how did that all come about, and how did it all evolve?
Yeah, that's definitely a big question. Uh, so it's interesting because I found that my disabilities, at least in my personal experience, are what have given me a lot of, as I say, fire in my belly and a lot of
Mm,
motivation to then go and do what I'm doing now. But at the same time, I found that when I was looking for more of your traditional 9 to 5 job, especially in the design industry, which is kind of my background, it proved to be a kind of mix of feelings of the design industry in particular has this funny thing of where quite a lot of people in the design industry are neurodivergent, but
mhm,
it's not spoken about. It's all very kind of like, oh yeah, that guy's got dyslexia, that guy's got dyscalculia, everybody in here is neurodivergent in X or Z way. And it's just it became quite interesting because I thought surely if that is the case, then it will make it a lot easier getting into the design industry. And consequently, it seems to be that because it's something that's not talked about, people didn't always understand of, for example, sketching within design is incredibly integral to be able to be a form of communication method. I know for a
mm,
fact, no matter how many handwriting classes I've done, how many hours I've done of sketching and just going and trying again and again, my wrist dexterity is not going to improve overnight enough to reach the same level as
yeah,
another designer per se. And so I found in lots of little ways there were limitations that were not always considered by these companies and were not always considered in terms of actually who is the real individual behind all of this work and the
mhm,
ideas that the person comes up with and where their strengths lie in that sense. And so, in all honesty, I think my experiences of that and my experiences with my disabilities and trying to progress in my career going forward just made me realize that if I want to have the impact I want to have, and if I want to do what I want to do, I kind of have to go on it alone, and I kind of have to
mm,
forge my own path because if the world is not ready to accept Robert McKenna, and if the world is not ready to be accessible in that sense, then I've kind of got to forge my own path, do my own thing, and then hopefully drag the world with me, and drag a part of
Mm-hmm.
society with me. So in the end, I kind of realized that entrepreneurship, in a sense, despite it being incredibly scary at times and incredibly stressful and incredibly anxiety filling, it is also one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done. And it's also the thing that makes me so, so happy. And it's the thing that I know that at the end of the day, because I do make my own rules in that sense, I don't need to worry about all of the things that my disabilities could do to potentially drag me back, and in fact use them to then empower me going forward.
Yeah. And it's very, very interesting the link between disability and entrepreneurship because so many disabled people are very often limited in terms of what another company will see in them. And so they're automatically shoved into a pigeonhole box when actually, we are some of the most creative thinkers out there naturally. Like sometimes we don't have a choice and it just comes to us. And actually entrepreneurship with disability kind of does go hand in hand sometimes if you are able to, right? Because it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could actually delve in a bit more as to what your company does and and what problems is it trying to solve in this world in terms of accessibility.
Yeah, 100%. So my company specifically is an inclusive design consultancy called Inclus. I've got the logo plastered on the t-shirt here. But what we focus upon is that we're trying to help make consumer products in particular, so physical products, more accessible and more inclusively designed for social minority groups. And a lot of this came from absolutely all sorts, to be honest. The two main stemming things that I always drag it back from is my experiences in terms of my own disabilities and lack of accessibility when it has come to particular products. For me personally, at least, a lot of that has come from
Mm.
anything that requires fine motor control. I find so many products incredibly frustrating, and I know I'm not the only person in that sense. But the other
Mm-hmm.
thing that it kind of stems from is that I remember as a young 16-year-old um, trying to work out what I wanted to do. And my mum said that there was this TV show on the BBC that was called The Big Life Fix. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. Let's give this a watch. And the first episode just entirely blew my mind. I didn't realize that there were designers, engineers, computer scientists out there actually aiming to create products that were going to change people's lives for the better and empower them to live the lives they want to lead. And as soon as I
Mm-hmm.
saw that, it just hit me. And I kind of went, that's exactly what I want to do. I don't care what it's called, but I want to do that for the rest of my life because I don't want to design a pair of shoes for the sake of designing a pair of shoes. I want to design a pair of shoes that then empowers somebody to go on those runs or empowers somebody to go and live the life they want to lead. Um, and so off all of the back of that, I've basically spent the past 6+ years doing loads of different industry projects from running social enterprises to where, in fact, I made a chopping board for people with upper limb differences and dexterity impairments
Mm-hmm.
that was called PrepMate. And even going into industry and working at the likes of Unilever, designing like inclusive deodorant packaging, which was a incredibly interesting experience. But ultimately, it
Mm-hmm.
was that point in industry that taught me very quickly, especially at the likes of Unilever. And I'm very happy to kind of like say it as it is. What I expected did not meet my expectations whatsoever. I thought with a company as large as Unilever that because of the marketing I'd seen and because of the PR that I'd seen, that they had this on lock. They knew exactly how to do inclusive design. They had it ingrained into their design process. And it's very much not the case. And it was very much the case of the other similar organizations were screwing it up in a similar way. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if people at Unilever and other companies as well, it isn't just Unilever to be candid about that. If they were to be fully self-aware, they would understand that they're not getting it right at the moment. And it is because it is still a very early thing. They're still trying to get around it. They're also fighting the fact of you've got cancel culture on one side that will want to destroy your brand if you make one mistake. So it
Mm-hmm.
kind of then made me realize after I'd been in industry and I was finishing up at university I think the only way that I can have the impact I want to have in terms of making the world a more accessible and inclusive place through the design of physical products, I'm going to have to go and push it myself because there's a gap in the market. There's an opportunity there. And in particular with the disability community, there's millions of people calling out for design changes and calling out for things that need to be fixed and things that need to be improved. And organizations at the moment are just not tapping into those communities enough and aren't listening well enough. And so that's something I'm hoping I can change.
Yeah. And I think you're so right when it comes to like the way that things have been designed for however long, right? Let's just say like since the beginning of time or whatever. It's
Mm,
always been for the non-disabled, and very, very rarely do the disabled actually get a look in when it comes to how things work for us. We always have to adapt to it. It never adapts to us. And actually to have that ability to be able to change that for people, I think is a really laudable thing to go after, because I think it's so necessary for so many people. And it's really interesting what you were saying about like the texture of products, because I was thinking about that when you said it, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true. There are some textures that I will not go near because it makes me feel physically unwell. Like,
mm,
and when it comes to like packaging and certain things like that, like I have a set of knives on me all the time to open packages because I can't rip it open. It doesn't work like that. And actually to be able to have something that would aid in that, or have accessible packaging, would be a massive game changer, because then I wouldn't be like, oh, where are my knives? Oh, I can just open it without using all my my kitchen cutlery.
yeah,
And that in itself it reminds me that actually, yes, we very much adapt to the world doesn't adapt to us. And how great would it be if you were able to create products where we don't have to adapt, they were adapted for us, we don't have to do any of the changes.
yeah. It's something that you're bang on the nail with it. Of that, there's a fantastic book that I'm not sponsored or anything, but there's a book called Mismatch that was written by Kat
Mm-hmm.
Holmes, who used to be the head of inclusive design at Microsoft. And it some of those lessons that are in there, people have to go and read it because it's such a small book as well. It's so easily digestible. But one of the lessons is kind of it hits entirely upon what you said of that design philosophy used to be that there was this kind of bell curve of humanity, and that
Mm-hmm.
designers had to basically understand of right, how do we design for the perfect human? How do we design for what is supposedly the
Yeah.
average human? And all of a sudden, it then creates all of these things that nobody then speaks about, as you say, because people come up with their own coping mechanisms and their own strategies. So you using your knife is probably something that if you've used that multiple times to open packaging, eventually it becomes so habitual that you don't even think about it that much anymore. And
Yeah.
and I've had similar experiences of where I had it of where I look back at my life and I go, oh my gosh, I used to like tuck it under my arm to open packaging, or I used to have to use a knife or something like that just to be able to do
Mm-hmm.
certain things. And it's something that just passively goes by. And so one of the best things that I always get when I speak to, in particular, people from the disability community is that people usually say a lot of the time, they're like, I'm so happy that there's somebody thinking about this because I wasn't thinking about it right here and now. And that's the way that it kind of is. And I saw it so much whilst I was at Unilever and so much over time in being involved in various projects of that you don't realize until you truly assess so many different products and so many different experiences and speak to so many different people that there are so many little things that can be those little annoying one percenters that if a company changed it, they could include so many more consumers and they could make so many more
Mm-hmm.
consumers feel included in the brand. And it can, at the end of the day, as you say, go back to something as simple as a texture. It can go down
Yeah.
to something as simple as what does this material feel like? It's something I even spoke about when we were doing deodorants and we are doing aerosol cans of that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes one of the manufacturing processes where it puts a form of like on the Lynx deodorant cans where it'll put a form of paint on the outside, it would always miss the bottom, and so it meant that the bottom had this horrible kind of aluminium scrapey kind of texture and feel.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of, in their infinite wisdom, just hadn't really recognized that whatsoever. They were just like, oh, that's just the way things are, move on. But I found that I spoke to even people with multiple sclerosis who can have a lot of sensory issues in some cases,
Yeah.
in terms of different symptoms. And I found even that as an example was so clear of the, oh my gosh, this is actually something that can be quite irritating and even mentally can
Hmm.
be incredibly frustrating. And so as soon as companies realize how easy inclusive design can be, that's when I feel as though it will start to snowball. And it's something that I'm trying to do with my company, of trying to frame that, of going like, inclusivity doesn't have to be, you need to pay millions of pounds to entirely change the design of everything. Like, that would be great if you could make it entirely inclusive in
Hmm.
that sense. But I know it's not realistic. So we have to work out how can we do this incrementally and
Yeah.
affordably and keep price still accessible.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think that that's like it's such a wonderful thing to hear because so many disabled people have been left on the back burner and like completely sidelining. As you were talking about deodorant cans, then I once dropped a deodorant can on my foot, and it was the most painful experience I have ever had in my entire life. And it was all
Yeah.
just because the bottom of the deodorant can was flat, and I was shaking it, and then kind of let go as I was shaking it. I stupidly let go, and it just bounced off my foot. And I have honestly never been in pain like that before in my life. And I now do not use that deodorant because it has a flat bottom. Like,
Yeah.
so these little things like do add up, and it's so right that when you think about like small incremental changes, it's a bit like the disabled community in general, right? It's not always about the huge, big changes because sometimes they're quite big and they're quite scary and they're so daunting. But often it's the incremental changes that happen. And when you build them up, they're more like building blocks than like this massive step, right? And steps are a lot easier than just like one massive leap. And there's so much to be said to be able to do that bit by bit rather than all at once, because you're right, there's also a monetary value to this. Okay, like we are talking about business, we are talking about companies, we're talking about people who want to make money. Like Unilever, their baseline is to make money. Yes, they give us products and that's amazing, but they want they want return, they want money. Like that's what they do.
Yeah.
But being able to have like small incremental changes, which mean that like each time you add something or you take something away or you think about something in a different way, you're including more people. That's incredible. And you're right, we probably don't have that forethought when it comes to design. Obviously, like I'm not a design scholar. Me and design, not really great friends. Like I just buy stuff that's on the shelf. I'm a consumer's delight. But being able to like small changes and like especially with design when we don't think about disabled people in design, being able to make those small changes for disabled people is just it's incredible for us because we know that we've been thought about in a world that hasn't thought about us for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's something that annoyingly, the kind of notion I get a lot of the time with my business is that people kind of see that inclusive design is a niche or that it's
Mm-hmm.
something of where it's not benefiting for everybody, when the whole point is that it's meant to be benefiting for every consumer. It's not just for one consumer.
Yeah.
So it the easiest way to explain it as well, and this isn't in all cases, but a lot of the time in the design process, for one, it is never linear, but it's easier to talk about it in a linear way. But
Mm-hmm.
if you kind of go from A to B, of going from problem to the final product, a lot of the time, when you look at accessible design, a lot of that comes from of where somebody has designed a product, they've launched the product and it's gone out there, and then a load of feedback has come back saying, oh, X person from the disability community has said that they find this incredibly frustrating and that they don't like this. And so they go, okay, how do we fix this? And then either a company comes in or that original company goes, right, how can we slap a kind of band-aid on this and make something that's really great accessible design, but it's going to be really expensive. It's also only going to be for very select individuals. And
Yeah.
that's how it's going to kind of be pushed. And I think that there is fully a world of where that could happen, and it could continue that way. But I personally don't believe that's the way it should be. The way it should be is
Mm-hmm.
that if you are truly inclusive in the design process and you truly include people from social minority groups throughout the process of product development, then you wouldn't need to get to the end and go, oh dear, we've mucked this up and we now need to do a load of accessible products add-ons to fix this. It should be something that is continuous and beneficial for all. And it's something, as I say, with that kind of framework. It's a framework of sorts that I'm building in the background at the moment to hopefully kind of push within the design industry. That it needs to be understood of how it can be from level one, which is very incremental, which is your tiny little design changes, which could all of a sudden open up this newer portion of the market of, say, people with dexterity impairments who maybe haven't bought your product previously before, because as you've rightly said, you can't open the packaging without getting a knife.
Yeah.
Um, or to the other end of the spectrum of where it's just literally like level five of where it's a world of where we entirely rethink about the user experience of using said product and think about, right, if we were to draw this back and really take it back to its bare bones, how could you make it inclusive from the start and accessible from the start? And in some circumstances, that's difficult for some companies. I find in particular startups are quite exciting because they're the easiest ones to do that from the start because they're still very
Yeah.
early on. Um, and then we also get to something I love talking about, which is a bonus level that I call level six, of where theoretically, if we were able to be in a world of where you quite literally have products that are able to, at their atomic level, change what they are like and be able to personalize according to the person, entirely change their
Mm-hmm.
structure for what they actually are and what their purpose is, what their usage is, then funnily enough, we'd be in quite an inclusive world because you would then be able to
Yeah.
have products that would be able to be entirely changed according to the person. And in a funny way, I would probably see that society wouldn't view disabilities in such a negative light as it can be viewed sometimes. It would be viewed more as just differences and just impairments of sorts. So I
Mm-hmm.
know that future is probably, well, it feels like a very long way away, but it's something I still always think about and talk to organizations about because it doesn't have to be level six. Level six is crazy. It would be beautiful, but it's
Yeah.
crazy. It is, how can we just do level one? How can we do little things and build and build and build?
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to young you. What
Mm.
is a piece of advice that you would give young Robert before his like design journey started?
It's interesting because I went to a workshop yesterday, in fact, and we asked a similar question. And the kind of main thing that I lean into. And I think I did it well as a child to some degree. And I think it is just
Mm-hmm.
because maybe because of, I find that it's similar with other people in the disability community that because of your life experiences, you build up a lot of resilience and you are able to find coping mechanisms for a lot of things. So you're quite resourceful and
Yeah.
innovative. But the piece of advice that I always would tell my younger self is that even when people think that you are crazy or that they are trying to knock you down and say that you can't do this or that there's something wrong with you or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
then people have to understand. I would want my younger self to understand that it's all just people talking and that's
Mm-hmm.
it. It's not, it doesn't need to define your world. It doesn't need to define your experience. And ultimately, if you just keep pressing, yes, the more people are going to say, you're crazy. What the hell are you doing? This is something that is near impossible. But you just have to keep pushing. And I think that was something I did as a kid, especially in creative subjects. I
Mm-hmm.
did not care what other people thought. I just entirely went on my own way, entirely ignored what people said, and still somehow got to where I am today. So I always feel as though that's always a nice reflection to go, if I've done this over the past, say, 10 years, even more than 10 years, there's no reason why I can't do this for another 10. So
Yeah.
that's definitely what I would say.
I love that. And also that ties in really nicely to thinking about positive things about ourselves because as members of the disabled community what I have recently, not recently, I say recently is a lie, but what I have found generally is that we find it very difficult to notice positive traits about ourselves when we've gone through hardship, because we just accept that that's who we are, and this is a life that we've been dealt, and we just carry on. But actually, if you reflect on any type of hardship that you've had, is there a particular positive trait about yourself that you're really proud of, and actually you're really proud to foster within yourself?
I think so. There's oh, this has conjured up a lot of thoughts. Um, there's there's an element. I'll kind of say it as how it is and what I'm thinking about it. But there's an element sometimes of where, in particular, when people look at the neurodivergent community, that there's this kind of spectrum, maybe per se, where people think you're very much on the extremes. You're either somebody that is incredibly introverted and wants to be left alone, and because the world is so overstimulating, you want to be kind of left in your black box, and that's that. Or you've got the other end,
Yeah.
which is where everything is just so hyperactive of that you just need energy and you need people's energy and you need everything to go at a million miles per hour. And I think what happened a lot for me at school, of where I struggled sometimes, is that people didn't always understand of why I would have times of where I needed that quiet and I needed that time to
Mm-hmm.
kind of just be able to sit with myself and be able to be in a space or to be able to be in a place of where it's not overloading and it is really anxiety freeing and it's great. But also in the fact that I found this in particularly through drama at school, that that just because you've seen Rob in that state, and just because you've seen Rob in that kind of element of where I want to be by myself just for a bit, I want to be in a space that feels really
Yeah.
nice. That doesn't mean that's me all the time. Like I'm not defined entirely by that one person or one element of a person that you've seen, because I would then go on stage, and I used to do lots of acting and lots of musical theatre and singing and all sorts, and I'd go and win singing competitions and I'd go and be the leading role in this musical theatre production. And people would always say the same thing. They would always say, I never saw that in you, Rob. Like it just came out of nowhere. And I think that that's something that I'm always very
Yeah.
proud of, because it's something of where, in a way, my disability of sorts in having dyspraxia and being neurodivergent would usually put me in a box of Robert needs to go in his own special room, and Robert needs a little bit of extra help, and Robert needs this time to kind of go at his own pace. It doesn't mean that I can't also do stuff that is extremely impressive, or that wins awards, or
Yeah.
that is incredibly creative. And so that's something
Mm-hmm.
I've always been incredibly proud of myself, and I need to always remember to keep that positive side of that, because it's something, as you say, we forget, and we don't reflect enough on it sometimes, and sometimes lean too much towards the negative, which are probably the flip side of like bullying I've had at school, and various other things like that. But the truth is that no matter how my disability has showed up, and no matter how that has been throughout my time as a child and at school,
Mm-hmm.
I always found a way to be resilient, always found a way to then show up in a different way, in a way that then made people go, "Oh, it's quite impressive. That was quite good, that."
I love that. And like, with neurodivergence, I think there are always, because it's like disability and neurodivergence, it's incredibly individual for the individual person, how it shows up, how it presents itself, what like sets you off, what upsets you, what gets you going. It's all completely different. And actually, with that in mind, have there been any weird questions you've had surrounding your disabilities?
Ooh, weird questions. So the I think maybe not a weird question, but a question that annoys me a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
it's something I've been debating a lot and could probably talk about for absolutely hours. It is because I'm somebody that has two non-visible disabilities, and I'm running a company that is very related to supporting the disability community. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of the time, people just say it how it is. They go, "What's your experience with disability? Do you even have a disability?" And
Yeah.
it kind of makes me go into my shell a little bit, because
Mm.
it makes me um, feel as though I'm not seen in that weird way. And then the problem is, for me personally, the flip side of that, for me to be seen, is that I need to walk around with some armband on that says I have a non-visible disability, or that I need to
Yeah.
wear a sunflower lanyard, which I think for some people, entirely brilliant, fantastic things. But for me personally, I just don't feel comfortable wearing them, and I don't want to wear them. And I feel as though that I should be entitled to be allowed to do that.
Mm.
And so the question that can be weird and can be annoying is just when people question, what disability do you actually have?
Yeah.
And I think it kind of came up a lot when there was that I think it was last year, where there was that government scheme of to do with what was it? Um,
Oh, was it
Asking.
ask, don't assume?
Yeah, yeah. So it was an interesting campaign. But the way that I saw it was that, for one, I don't agree with asking just straight up, because that's just a bit
Hmm.
rude and it's a bit personal, and it's different for every single person of how comfortable they are to speak about that sort of thing. Um, I did align more so though with the don't assume part, purely on the basis of
Yeah.
that I find it is so easy to assume. And it's something that even in my role, I've done it previously myself, and I will happily hold my hands up and say that I've done it. And I think we all do
Hmm.
it because, in particular with non-visible disabilities, it is not on the surface. It's not clear to what
Yeah.
it is, and it's not clear as how it shows up. But the only thing I would say to it is that sometimes people have to make sure that, rather than jumping to the gun and kind of questioning what disability do you even have or anything like that, is kind of allowing to have the self-awareness to understand that disability is such this wide spectrum that we're not back in the kind of like 1900s of where it is just
Yeah.
solely somebody in a wheelchair. It is, we have to understand there's this greater diversity and there's this greater spectrum of what disability actually is and what it is defined to be. And so people just have to be more open to the fact of that you probably interact with a lot of people every single day who have non-visible disabilities that you probably never even knew have them. And
Yeah.
that's perfectly fine. That's the way the world is. And so I'd appreciate it if it stop getting weird questions of kind of being like, what even is your disability? Or I don't get it.
Hmm.
So,
I think that that's such a poignant like snippet and takeaway, because it comes back to that, well, what does disability look like? And actually, there is not a one size fits all. And obviously this comes from all of our like it's not the design, but obviously we're talking about design, so I'm going to call it design. But when we think about like disabled parking bays, it's a wheelchair user. When we think about disabled access in like any public space, it's a wheelchair user. Like that is always the image that is used. But actually, you know, not all disabled people use a wheelchair.
mm,
And like not all disabled people who need a disabled parking bay use a wheelchair. And it comes from that, like, well, what does disability look like? Well, actually, it looks like a range of different things, because it's a massive umbrella term, and everybody who uses it is completely valid to use it. And so we need to have that almost like re-education of what does disability look like, because actually it looks like every single person in the entire world, which is a massive blanket statement, and I'm very aware of that, but actually it's true, because everybody who has disability relates to disability differently. They relate to their disability differently, they relate to other people's disability differently, but it's so individual to that individual person that I kind of understand needing to use like a sign or like an image to signify, but actually I think that just needs a bit of an update, really. So maybe you're the person to do it. That could be like the next thing that you do.
maybe it is a project that needs to be explored. But there's loads of kind of mini projects, even with stuff like that, of kind of, not to detract too much, but there's even projects that was looking at the design of symbols in terms of saying that there's a baby changing room toilet,
Hmm.
um, because
Yeah.
they've naturally over time always been very much, it's a female holding a baby on some kind of bed, and that's the symbol that is
Hmm.
used. But it's trying to understand that that's not always the case. Like,
Yeah.
it could be anybody going in there to do that. But I think it is a similar thing in terms of disability, of that we have to understand of how do we uh, show to the world of what that actually is like in all of its diversity. And some of the biggest ones that I always find are very difficult with organizations sometimes is always usually the non-visible disabilities. And it is
Yeah.
usually always, in particular, I found quite a lot in terms of mental health. So it can be such little things. So I won't say who the client is, but I was working with a client that runs a kind of tech product company, and one of the things that we were
Mm.
talking about was battery life. So something that people probably don't think about at all is that for somebody that has anxiety, whatever that anxiety disorder may be, the anxiety that maybe people feel who don't have a form of mental health disorder, that in terms of the anxiety of, oh, my phone's running out of battery, or this is running out of battery. For somebody
Mm.
with that anxiety disorder, it can be 10 times worse. It can be absolutely
Mm.
crippling to know, what am I going to do next? What do I do if this runs out of battery? And it can perpetuate, and it can become this thing that is fully consuming of your life
Yeah.
over this tiny little interaction. And so, by simply the advice I gave in terms of simply communicating better of what is the battery level at, giving people notice of that, making sure that the experience in that sense is communicated in an accessible way, all of a sudden that then helps to reduce how negative that user experience could potentially be. And it's something that I find even with a lot of consumer products, it's just not focused enough. And it is because, as you say, the view on disability is still very much entirely physical impairments from at least what I've
Mm.
seen. And it is still very much annoyingly in a lot of organizations still leaning towards just the wheelchair symbol and not enough of this full spectrum. So the good thing is that I'm only 23, so I've got a lot of career left in me, and I've got a lot
Yeah.
of fire left in me. So I'm hoping that over the decades, I can certainly make some form of change that will hopefully make people's lives a lot easier.
Yeah. I've only got one final question for you, and that
Yeah.
is, Rob, are you disabled and proud?
I would say 100% I am disabled and proud. I am somebody that is very much proud of my disabilities, proud of how that's formed to make me the person that I am today. And I mean, it's entirely formed the work that I do and the change that I'm trying to make. And so I'm very much disabled and proud, very much so. I like that. I'm going to put that on a post-it note.
Rob, thank you so much for today. I've genuinely learnt a lot about inclusive design, and I really like that because I like learning something new that's so far out of my own like remit of life, which is great. And it's been really interesting to hear you talk about inclusive design. And I think there's so much to take away from how something you said right at the beginning was that if design was fully inclusive, like 365, 24/7, we would view disability differently. And I think that is so on the money. And I love that. And I think that's something that I really want to take away from today is that actually design needs to be more inclusive. And it's people like you who are paving the way for that. So thank you for giving up your time today to come on the pod. And like thank you for all the work you're doing as well.
No worries at all. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.